today's mindful moment. We always think, like the biggest threats to America, they're coming from somewhere else, right? Across the ocean, some foreign power with bad intentions trying to mess us up.
Yeah.
But what if I told you the real danger, like the sneaky stuff, is brewing right here at home?
Oh, okay. I'm listening.
Yeah, and it's all fueled by ideas,
Yeah.
ideas that are taking root right here in America, among our own people. Scary thought, right?
Definitely a bit unsettling. Makes you think. Like, we always look outward for those threats, but sometimes the danger is closer than we think.
Exactly. And today, we are going deep, really deep, into a pretty unsettling chapter of American history.
Okay, hit me with it.
We're talking about a time when, believe it or not, homegrown fascist movements started gaining some serious traction.
Wow, okay. Homegrown fascism, that's heavy stuff.
It is. And our mission in this deep dive is to understand this period, figure out who these key players were, what made them tick, and really get a grip on the dangers these ideologies posed. And we're doing all of this through the lens of Rachel Maddow's book, Prequel, An American Fight Against Fascism. She really did her homework on this
Oh,
one.
I've heard good things about that book. Really thorough research, right?
Incredibly thorough. I mean,
Yeah.
she pulls from all these different sources, like James Q. Whitman's work on how, get this, Nazi Germany actually studied American racial laws.
No way. Seriously.
And then there's Laura B. Rosenzweig. She dives into Hollywood's role in all of this. Plus, you've got insights from Mark Lamster's biography of Philip Johnson, Gerald Horne's perspective on race and fascism, Roger Jeffries Jones looking into Nazi espionage, Stephen Watts on Huey Long. I mean, the list goes on. It's like she wove together this incredibly detailed tapestry of historical analysis.
Sounds comprehensive for sure. So where do we even begin with something this complex?
Well, let's rewind a bit. Back to the years leading up to World War I. We've got to talk about early pro-German sentiment in the U.S. and the propaganda efforts that were already in full swing.
Oh, yeah. The propaganda game was strong back then. Lots of folks trying to sway public opinion.
Big time. And the guy we need to start with, the one who really gets this ball rolling, is George Sylvester Viereck.
Okay, Viereck. What's his story?
So he was the guy behind this pro-German magazine. First, it was called The Fatherland, which, let's be honest, pretty much lays it all out there.
Straight to the point, huh?
Right.
Right.
But later, they softened it up a bit and called it Viereck's American Weekly. Either way, it became like this major platform for pushing pro-German views and trying to get Americans on board with their cause.
A mouthpiece for Germany, basically.
Exactly. And you wouldn't believe how much money the German government was pumping into this propaganda machine targeting the U.S. We're talking like $2 million per week in 1915 dollars.
Whoa, hold on. $2 million a week back then. That's an insane amount of money. What were they doing with it all? Just pamphlets and stuff.
Oh, it was way more than pamphlets. They were funding magazines, news digests. They were even bankrolling American isolationist figures to get their message out. There were even whispers, and I mean whispers, about potential sabotage operations they were considering on American soil.
Sabotage. Like actual attacks.
We're talking rumors here, but yeah, that's the kind of stuff they were discussing. I mean, to put that $2 million a week into perspective, that's almost $60 million a week in today's money.
That's mind-blowing. Clearly, Germany saw the U.S. as a major player, and they were willing to spend big to try and control the narrative.
Absolutely. I mean, this was way before the U.S. even entered the war.
Okay.
But Germany was already playing the long game, trying to either win America over or at least keep us out of the fight.
It's like they knew how much power the U.S. could wield, and they wanted to neutralize that threat before it even materialized.
It's a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, look at how strategic thinking and propaganda were already at play back then. And it wasn't like everyone was just sitting back and letting it happen. Teddy Roosevelt, that guy was never afraid to speak his mind, and he had some choice words for Viereck.
Oh, yeah. Teddy was not one to mince words, especially when it came to patriotism. What did he have to say?
Well, he basically told Viereck that if he loved Germany so much, he should just give up his American citizenship, pack his bags, and go fight for them.
Ouch. That's a pretty direct hit. Not exactly subtle.
Nope, not at all. You can practically feel the heat coming off that letter. Roosevelt saw Viereck's pro-German stance as a complete betrayal, a slap in the face to America.
Makes sense. I mean, Roosevelt was all about American strength and unity. Viereck's whole vibe must have felt like a direct threat to that.
Right. And Roosevelt wasn't the only one who felt that way. There was a lot of suspicion directed at anyone who seemed too cozy with Germany, especially as things started heating up in Europe. Now, let's fast forward a bit. Viereck, This guy who was so pro-Germany, he ends up developing a huge fascination with Adolf Hitler.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this is where things get really interesting and disturbing. Viereck and Hitler. How did they even cross paths?
Well, they actually met in person back in 1923. It was still early days for Hitler, but he was already making waves with his intense speeches and his unique views.
I bet. So what went down during that meeting? What kind of impression did Hitler make on Viereck?
Well, Hitler basically laid out his whole worldview for Viereck, his big grievances.
Yeah.
He talked about the Treaty of Versailles, how he saw it as this huge injustice against Germany. And then there was the threat of Bolshevism, which he was totally obsessed with.
The Treaty of Versailles, that was the agreement that ended World War I, right? And it was pretty harsh on Germany.
Yeah, it really was. And Hitler used that resentment, that feeling of being unfairly punished, to fuel his rise to power.
Classic demagoguery. Find a common enemy, blame all the problems on them, and then present yourself as the solution.
You got it. And Hitler, well, he was a master at playing that game.
So Viereck was buying into all of this.
Yeah, it seems so. I mean, at first he saw Hitler more as a poet, a passionate speaker, but he got increasingly caught up in Hitler's charisma. He even started comparing him to Napoleon. Talk about a red flag.
Yikes. I guess Viereck missed, or maybe ignored, some pretty crucial signs about the direction Hitler was headed.
Definitely. And by 1940, Viereck had basically become this, reliable voice for pro-German propaganda in the U.S. It's almost hard to believe looking back.
It makes you wonder what was so compelling about Hitler that he could win over someone like Viereck, who was already predisposed to favor Germany.
Right. I mean, it shows how a powerful personality, combined with a message that taps into existing fears and prejudices, can really manipulate people. And unfortunately, Viereck wasn't alone. We start to see other Americans, individuals and groups who were not just sympathetic to Germany, but were actively trying to create a fascist movement right here in the U.S.
Okay, so now we're talking about a homegrown problem. This is beyond just liking Germany. This is about wanting to change America, reshape it, using a very dangerous ideology.
Exactly. And this is where things take a really dark turn. We start to see figures like Lawrence Dennis emerge. He was like the intellectual architect of American fascism.
Intellectual architect, like he was trying to give it legitimacy.
Yes, he was trying to make it seem like a viable, even necessary path for America. Then there was Philip Johnson, this architect who would later become super famous, but in the early 30s, he was really into Hitler and fascism.
That's wild. I had no idea about Johnson's past. So these guys, plus Viereck, they were the main players in this whole homegrown fascism thing.
They were some of the big names, yeah. But there were others too, like William Dudley Pelley. He started this group called the Silver Shirts. And then there was George Detheridge. He was all about white supremacy and had some really extreme views, even compared to the others.
Wow. Okay, so this wasn't just some small fringe movement. We're talking about multiple groups with different leaders, all pushing for fascism in America.
Exactly. And they weren't just talking. They were organizing, recruiting, and in some cases even plotting violence.
Yeah.
They were a real threat.
Okay, so let's break down these groups a bit. Let's start with Pelley and his Silver Shirts. They seem like a carbon copy of the Nazis, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, they had the Silver Shirts. They tried to create this whole paramilitary structure. And Pelley himself, he really saw himself as America's Hitler. He even believed he had this, divine destiny to lead.
So not just a copycat, but also delusional.
Oh, definitely. And his views were just awful. I mean, he was deeply anti-Semitic. He talked about rounding up Jewish people and improvident colored people, as he called them. His plans were truly horrific.
It's frightening how these hateful ideologies can twist people's minds, make them believe they're on some kind of righteous mission.
Absolutely. And then you've got Philip Johnson, who would later become this giant in the architecture world. But back then, he was trying to start an American version of the brown shirts. He called them the gray shirts. Can you believe that?
Gray shirts. Seriously, what was he thinking?
It's hard to say.
Huh.
I mean, maybe he was just drawn to power, or maybe he really believed in this fascist ideology. But it's a stark reminder that these ideas can take root in unexpected places.
For sure. And Johnson wasn't just a lone wolf, right? He actually had a brief fling with Huey Long, the populist politician. What was that about?
Yeah, that was a strange chapter. I think Johnson saw Long's popularity as a way to advance his own ambitions. Maybe he thought he could use Long to gain power and influence.
So a bit of opportunism mixed in with his fascist leanings.
Seems like it. And speaking of Huey Long, he's an interesting case. I mean, his Share Our Wealth program had some really progressive economic policies. He was hugely popular during the Depression.
Yeah, Long was a bit of a paradox. He was this charismatic populist who championed the common person, but he also had this authoritarian streak that made some people nervous.
Right. And Lawrence Dennis, this intellectual godfather of American fascism we talked about, he actually thought Long could be the guy who, even unintentionally, paves the way for some kind of American autocracy.
Interesting. So Dennis saw Long's popularity, his ability to connect with the masses, as a potential tool that could be used to undermine democracy, even if Long himself wasn't explicitly fascist.
That was his theory. And even Philip Johnson, for a brief time, thought about aligning himself with Long. But it seems like Johnson's motivations were, as always, more about his own climb to power. He even dreamed of, like, eclipsing Long and becoming the leader himself.
Wow, so Johnson was really playing both sides, flirting with these different powerful figures, always looking for an angle to advance his own agenda.
It's almost Shakespearean, isn't it? All these ambitious figures vying for power, using ideology as a tool to achieve their goals.
Definitely a lot of drama unfolding there. And it's a reminder that movements, even those with seemingly good intentions, can be hijacked by those seeking personal gain.
Truth. And it's also a testament to Long's charisma that he could inspire such intense reactions, both positive and negative. Some saw him as a savior, others as a potential dictator in the making. It really highlights the complexities of power and how it can be perceived and wielded in such different ways.
Yeah, Long's story is a fascinating one, and it speaks to the enduring power of populism in American politics, both its potential for good and its potential for danger.
Totally agree. Okay, so this next part is really unsettling. This is where things get, like, truly chilling. Maddow, she draws on James Q. Whitman's work, this book called Hitler's American Model, and she talks about how Nazi lawyers actually studied American racial segregation laws. They were looking for a blueprint for their own anti-Semitic policies.
Wait, hold on. You're saying the Nazis were inspired by American laws, like our system of racial discrimination?
I know, it's hard to believe, right? But that's what Whitman's research shows. They looked at things like the resegregation of the federal workforce under Woodrow Wilson.
Wilson, the guy who's supposed to be this progressive icon.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? And they also looked at the restrictive immigration laws passed under Calvin Coolidge. They were fascinated by how America had created this system of legalized discrimination.
It's sickening to think that our country, with its supposed ideals of equality, actually provided a model for Nazi Germany's horrors.
I know. It's a really dark stain on our history. And it really exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of America's claims of equal protection under the law.
It's a stark reminder that ideals don't always match reality. And it also shows how easily those ideals can be twisted and manipulated to serve hateful agendas.
100%. It's really sobering thought. But thankfully, it wasn't all doom and gloom. There were people who were fighting back against these rising fascist and anti-Semitic movements. We have to talk about Leon Lewis. This guy was a true hero.
Leon Lewis, okay. Tell me about him. What did he do?
He dedicated his life to fighting these groups, these Nazi and anti-Semitic organizations that were popping up in the U.S. He infiltrated them. He exposed their plans. He was incredibly brave. There's a book called Hitler in Los Angeles by Stephen Ross that goes into detail about his work.
Wow. Sounds like he was taking on some serious risks. What kind of things did he uncover?
Some pretty terrifying stuff, like there was this plot by a group of U.S. Marines. They were planning to sell weapons to American fascists.
No way. Marines involved in this.
Yep. And there was even a plot involving cyanide. They were going to poison Jewish families.
That's just evil. It's hard to even comprehend the level of hate driving those plans.
It is. But Lewis and others like him, they were out there working to stop it. They were a crucial line of defense against this rising tide of extremism.
It's inspiring to know that even in such dark times, there are people willing to stand up and fight for what's right.
Absolutely. And then there were the Dies Committee hearings. They were originally focused on investigating communism, but they actually ended up uncovering a lot of information about these far-right groups as well.
Ah, the Dies Committee. They were quite a force back then. So how did they stumble upon these fascist groups?
Well, part of it was thanks to some brave witnesses, people like John C. Metcalf. He testified before the committee and basically blew the whistle on all these different fascist and Nazi sympathizing organizations.
Wow, so even though the committee wasn't specifically looking for this stuff, they ended up playing a crucial role in exposing it.
Exactly. And all this time, The German propaganda machine was still churning away, trying to influence American public opinion. They were spending millions on magazines, news digests, you name it. They even had this thing called Facts in Review, which was basically just pro-German propaganda disguised as objective news.
Sneaky but effective. I mean, if people are getting their news from a source they think is unbiased, they're more likely to accept the information without question.
Exactly. And it's not like this was just some small-scale operation.
Mhm.
I mean, we even had American politicians echoing these pro-German talking points.
Really? Like who?
Well, there was Congressman Hamilton Fish and Senator Ernest Lundin. Their speeches were basically ripped straight from German propaganda.
That's wild. Elected officials pushing a foreign power's agenda. It makes you wonder about their motivations.
Right. Were they true believers? Were they being manipulated? It's hard to say for sure.
But it definitely shows how pervasive this propaganda was and how it could even influence people in positions of power.
Totally. And then there was Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest. His broadcast reached millions of people. He started out as this populist figure railing against economic injustice. But his rhetoric became more and more extreme, and eventually he became openly anti-Semitic.
Coughlin, the radio priest. Yeah, I've heard of him. A classic example of how someone can start with seemingly good intentions and then take a really dark turn.
He was really good at tapping into people's anxieties and frustrations, but he ended up using that power to spread hatred and division.
And his message resonated with a lot of people, right? I mean, his broadcasts were hugely popular.
Huge. And all that anti-Semitic rhetoric, it helped fuel the rise of the Christian Front. This was a group with a very militant, anti-communist, and deeply anti-Semitic agenda.
The Christian Front. Wow, so this wasn't just some abstract ideological debate anymore. We're talking about organized groups actively promoting violence.
Exactly. And the FBI actually launched an investigation into the Christian Front. They sent in an undercover agent, Dennis Healy.
Undercover, that must have been dangerous work. What did they find out?
Well, Healy discovered that they were stockpiling weapons and planning acts of violence. It was clear they were serious about their agenda. They even went to trial in 1940.
So even though this was all happening before the U.S. officially entered World War II, the threat was very real and present.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then, of course, everything changed on December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, the U.S. was at war, and public opinion shifted dramatically.
That was the turning point. Suddenly, supporting Germany or Japan was no longer seen as just a difference of opinion. It was treasonous.
Right. And the government started cracking down on these pro-Nazi figures. George Sylvester Viereck, William Dudley Pelley, they both faced sedition trials.
The sedition trials, they were a big deal at the time, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. I mean, it showed that the government was finally taking this threat seriously. But those trials were also super complicated. It was hard to prove seditious conspiracy, and there were all sorts of political machinations going on behind the scenes.
Right. It's never as simple as just rounding up the bad guys. The legal system, especially in wartime, is fraught with complexities.
For sure. And there was this whole other investigation led by O. John Raj that looked into Nazi influence in the U.S., but his report was ultimately suppressed.
Wow, suppressed. Why? What were they trying to hide?
It's hard to say for sure. Maybe it was just too embarrassing. Or maybe there were powerful people who didn't want certain things to come to light.
It makes you wonder how deep this whole thing went.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why this period of history is so fascinating and so disturbing. It shows that fascism wasn't just a problem over there in Europe. It was right here at home, fueled by American citizens, American ideas. And those ideas, that hate, it never really goes away. It just morphs and finds new ways to express itself.
It's a chilling reminder that vigilance is crucial, especially in times of crisis. We have to be aware of the signs, the subtle ways that extremist ideologies can take root and spread. And it's our responsibility to speak out against it, to challenge it wherever we see it.
I couldn't agree more. And it makes you think about the kinds of narratives we're consuming today, the stories we're being told, and how those stories might be shaping our understanding of the world. If you're interested in exploring that further, I think you'd find the AI audiobook analysis YouTube channel, Mindful Moments, really thought-provoking. They do some great work looking at how we process and understand these complex narratives.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just something we read about in books. It informs the present, shapes the future.
It does. And sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that challenge our assumptions and force us to confront difficult truths.
Definitely. Understanding our past, even the ugly parts, is crucial for navigating the present and building a better future.
100%. So if you found this deep dive into a really critical and often overlooked period of American history as fascinating and thought-provoking as we did, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes. And hey, share this episode with anyone you think might be interested. We want to keep these conversations going.
Absolutely. The more we can understand these historical patterns, the better equipped we'll be to recognize and confront similar challenges in our own time.
Exactly. And if you want to dive even deeper into this whole story, make sure you check out Rachel Maddow's book, Prequel. We've got a link in the show notes. Your support helps us keep bringing you these in-depth analyses. And on that note, we'll wrap things up. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed.